Hello, and welcome to the Objective Health Show. I am your host today, Erica, and joining me in the studio is Doug, Elliot, and behind the scenes is Damien.
Hello.
So welcome all.
Hello.
So today we're going to talk about poisoned agriculture and the possibilities of something different. So for our listeners, this may be a new topic, or you may have followed this since the beginning of time, but we're living in a revolutionary time where industrial agriculture has almost completely taken over our food system. So we've become very technologically dependent, at least in the United States, on modern methods of farming. And these modern methods, whether it's genetic modification or high-intensity chemicals, fertilizers, and pesticides, are leading to toxification at an alarming rate and soil degradation. Also, serious issues with human health. We've covered topics like this before in the past, but I think it's a good opportunity to revisit this idea as the food industry is changing rapidly with the introduction of synthetic biotechnology, fake meat, and basically chemical shitstorm of food that's available to the public these days. And so we're hoping this will be a lively discussion. It's also, in a sense, kind of depressing because when you look through the material, you realize that while there is a concern with, the changing climate, there is also a concern with a lack of biodiversity and the dying off of key species, things like pollinators, bees and butterflies, and how this monocropping kind of industrialized food system is really going to destroy the planet.
Yeah, pretty much. And it's funny because the people who represent that, big agriculture kind of, they always try to kind of give it that greenwashing spin, that all the things that they're doing are actually to help the environment and how it's good for the environment. And, I mean, particularly I think of genetically modified crops. When genetic modification came out, they were really selling it in a way that, oh yeah, this is going to feed the world. This is going to be drought-resistant crops or flood-resistant crops or extra vitamins and minerals and all this kind of stuff. And, it's going to be so good for the environment. And really what they've given us is the absolute complete opposite of that. Like things that require more poisons, more toxic garbage. It costs more. It has less yield. So I find it really funny that it's whatever you hear about things, whenever you hear it's somebody's selling something as environmentally friendly, it's almost like more often than not, if you dig into it, it's going to be the exact complete opposite.
Completely agree with you on that. We have an interesting little clip of a show that Chris Hedges did with Dr. Vandana Shiva. And for our listeners who may not have heard of her, she is a seed activist. Well, she's actually a physicist, but she's a seed activist in India. And she's written many books about the Green Revolution, kind of this agricultural nightmare that hit India and how it's just spreading, and this idea of viral piracy. So the eliminating of, seeds and small farmers. And so I want Damien to play this clip so you can get an idea of what we're trying to cover in this show.
Caused by industrial farming. The commodification of food by corporations has altered the ways we produce, process, and distribute food to serve corporate profit rather than people's health and well-being. Industrial agriculture poisons the soil and water and uses its economic monopoly to destroy the ability of small farmers to sustain themselves and their families. The reconfiguration of food production is degrading our ecosystem as well as our health. There are 1 billion people across the globe who endure hunger and malnutrition, and 2 billion who suffer from diseases including diabetes, heart disease, and obesity, caused by processed foods loaded with chemicals, fat, and sugar. The pesticides used by industrial agriculture have contributed to an epidemic of cancers. Food, in short, has become another commodity. The natural world is treated as a machine. If we are to survive as a species, it will mean radically changing how we produce the food we consume. Joining me in the studio to
Yeah, so joining him in the studio is Vandana Shiva, and we'll have some information from her later on in the show. But I think, what our listeners may not know is this idea of this high-intensity industrial model. And, like Doug was saying, this idea of GMOs going to save us all. And when you start to look into the numbers, especially here in the United States, it's pretty disturbing. We were reading an article called Toxic Agriculture, Poisonings of Soils, Human Health, and the Environment. And they were talking about how 34,000 different types of pesticides are currently registered for use in the United States. And those were approved by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. They also talk about how industrial agriculture, 75% of all land used in the U.S. to grow food or raise animals, relies on these chemicals. And so we see this health epidemic happening across the globe. And I think a lot of times people don't really look into what's causing that. Or, they say, well, it's diet, but then we don't really go into what part of the diet that means.
Well, we did a previous show. Actually, it was Elliot and me. It was the Bro Show we did a while ago where we were talking about endocrine disruptors. And one of the big things I think that's causing a lot of these problems is the herbicides, pesticides, and things that they are endocrine disruptors. So, Chris Hedges mentioned cancer there, but there is a whole laundry list of problems that can be caused by endocrine disruptors. And that's only, of the 34,000 chemicals that are being sprayed onto crops, endocrine disruptors are one category of those. So, there's just the huge list of problems that can come up from this poisoned agriculture is just, it's stunning. And it's, it contaminates groundwater, it's on the food, it's in the air, it's everywhere.
And it's, it's so prevalent. It's showing up in breast milk for mothers. It's so concerning in so many ways. And even the pollinating insects. We're seeing just a huge decrease in things like bees. And I think people don't really realize that if you don't have pollinating insects, you don't have food, period.
And just in the context of health, you mentioned about these chemicals being found in breast milk, but they're found in, there was a couple of studies which showed that they found traces of these chemicals in every single person. So like every single person they tested, a lot of it's stored in our fat. It means it's lipophilic, which means that when we take it into our body, can't process it there and then, we're going to store it into our fat tissue. And there's actually lots of kind of evidence to suggest that, okay, this is maybe contributing to things like chronic obesity, which can't be resolved by things like diet. But then aside, like Erica just said about the pollinating insects, there's also the microbes in the soil. So the composition of microbes, which kind of make up the soil-based organisms, they're really responsible for allowing a plant to grow as it should do, but also to provide the nutrients that it should do. So a plant that is growing in soil which is kind of bereft of certain microorganisms and is being disrupted by these kinds of chemicals and stuff over a long period of time, what they're finding now is that actually the food that's growing in the soil now is actually less nutritious. So when you compare something like an organic carrot to a non-organic carrot, which is being grown on like conventional or kind of industrial farming plot, you're going to find a significantly different nutrient composition. And they're finding this with lots of different vegetables, grains, that kind of stuff. And essentially the point is that when these kind of, you go through several generations of these vegetables on this industrial farming kind of setup, then you're basically depleting those vegetables of nutrients. And so when you compare it, it's like the organic comes on top. So it's it's lower in toxic chemicals, but it's also completely different in terms of what food or what nutrition it can provide the human body, which is, I think is fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, just some statistics on that. Some research was done on soil, at least here in the United States, and they were talking about how there's a 41% to 100% decrease in vitamin A in 6 different foods: apples, bananas, broccoli, onion, potato, and tomato. And then it goes on to say both onions and potatoes saw 100% loss of vitamin A between the years 1951 and 1999. So that's not even in the year 2000. And having worked in farming for the last 20 years, I've never worked on an industrial farm, but I have seen many industrial farms, and I have seen the degradation that happens. And I'll just use from my experience, I lived in Hawaii for many years, and Hawaii was a very heavy, chemical intensive farming of pineapple and sugarcane. And when those industries were moved to other countries because of the cost of labor and whatnot, those soils were never treated, and basically it was leased to farmers who would come and try and start sustainable or organic farms. Well, some of the soil was so toxic with things like arsenic and mercury that you couldn't plant things like lettuce or broccoli or foods that you could eat. You could only plant trees that would be edible later because the filtration system of the tree. So my point being in all that is this is not something you can reverse in a year or 2 years. And what Elliot was saying is it's completely destroyed essentially the microbiome of the soil. So there's no nutrition left in the soil to feed the plant. It's completely toxic more than anything. And there are methods that we'll get into later in the show about how to regenerate the soil. It does take a lot of physical labor. It's not something that can be done by quote unquote innovation, which is a word that I see a lot now in this whole greenwashing of agriculture. Innovation is not going to save the soil. We need to find our way back to ways like tilling and animal husbandry that actually bring natural, and I hate to use the word organic, but organic elements back into the soil, because it's like 6% of the Earth's crust is topsoil, and if we don't have it, there's no way humans can survive.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually, that people don't really know necessarily, or excuse me, a lot of people don't really seem to know just how important topsoil really is. You know, that is kind of like the fundamental component that all our food relies on. You know, if you don't have topsoil, you can't grow anything. And if you can't grow anything, it's like not only can you not grow any vegetables for yourself or any plants at all, but animals can't eat anything either. So it's like fundamental to the entire food chain is topsoil. And there are ways of farming that regenerate topsoil. And actually, that's a very good thing. Industrial agriculture is not the least bit concerned with regenerating topsoil, because they're just basically dumping chemicals on to try and replace what topsoil is essentially doing. So they are using chemical fertilizers, which do kind of a half-assed job of feeding the plants. And because the plants aren't doing so well, then weeds and pests can kind of take over. So then they use pesticides and herbicides to try and control for that. And it's just this whole system ends up being completely dependent on this technology that is completely against nature. It's basically like going in and trying to bend nature to their will by force. And in order to do that, it's such a toxic process that everything that's coming out of that, including the food, but also like, you know, the pollutants that it's giving off, the degradation of the environment, everything about it is completely toxic. And it's like we've become completely reliant on this system that is like, it's cancer. It's like the entire planet has cancer because we have been like taken up this completely backward and short-sighted method. Whereas, like, you know, if you went back to like the, you know, the Middle Ages, actually you probably don't even have to go back that far. You go back like, you know, a few hundred years, and it's like people had an understanding about this kind of thing. They knew how to farm. They knew how to, you know, their crops were probably much more drought resistant or flood resistant or whatever, just because they were employing these natural methods. They were working with nature rather than completely working against it.
Yeah, and I think that the United States has exported this idea of synthetic fertilizers. We won't get into the backstory of all that because the synthetic fertilizer industry kind of came out of the war industry, the chemical, you know, high intensive chemical inputs. But the more that, you know, farmers use synthetic fertilizers, the more increasing amounts they need to use each year. And that benefits companies selling these products. I mean, it's a business model set up for profit at the cost of everyone else's health. You know, one of the things you were saying about cancer, you know, not only in the US and Europe, but in Argentina, you know, the spiraling rates of cancer because of glyphosate for production of soy. I think Argentina is doing soy, a lot of soy, but also in India, where this green revolution was introduced, you know, they have a cancer epicenter, and Indian soils are being depleted as a result of this application, and it's losing 5,000 million tons of soil every year due to soil erosion and water contamination, and it's just insidious. You know, the Indian Council of Agriculture Research that reports that soil is becoming so deficient in nutrients and fertility that small holders are being driven from their land. They cannot produce food on these lands anymore because they're so toxic. And that's not even going into the effect of the water, because every crop needs water to grow. And these things are all going into waterways. And so it's just this endless cycle. And the solutions that Big Ag is offering is even worse.
Yeah. Seems kind of ironic that it's referred to as the Green Revolution. You know, it's kind of like, yeah, it's just like it's probably the first instance of greenwashing.
Yes, exactly. And the man that kind of came up with it, his name is Norman Borlaug. He won a Nobel Peace Prize for the Green Revolution. And he set out what he called his wheat apostles to spread 12 different scientists to spread this green revolution around the world. And, you know, there's, again, Dr. Vandana Shiva has been just trying to get information out to people about what this has done to an entire country as far as being able to provide food for their own communities, their own areas, and eliminating breeds of seeds that have been farmed for thousands of years that have supported people. So this idea of creating this monoculture, complete control of all food.
Yeah.
We have another video, Damien, if you want to play it. I kind of dubbed this clip the Poison Cartel, and you'll see why.
Okay, give me 1 sec here. That 1320, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Welcome back to On Contact. We continue our conversation about global food production with Dr. Vandana Shiva. So that figure, which I caught during the break, was 90% of crop varieties have disappeared.
90% crop varieties have been pushed to extinction by the poison cartel, which is engaged in ecocide.
And not just crop varieties.
Not just crop varieties, because on crops depend the pollinators. And when your plants that feed the monarch butterfly are killed, 90% of the monarch butterfly goes. When your neonicotinoids and your pesticides are sprayed and the Bt toxin in every leaf of the plant releases a poison, your bees disappear. We are in an extinction crisis, and it's this poison cartel, this is responsible for it.
Let's talk about the suicides before we get into the IT. The journalist, is it PJ Senath?
Yeah, so they were about to talk about all the Indians, farmers that have committed suicide as a result of the Green Revolution. We won't go into that in today's show, but basically it's again, destroying an entire country and their way of life, but this Green Revolution. So it hasn't really provided anything but additional funding and profit for corporations.
Yeah.
And the control of the food.
Death to everybody else.
Yeah.
Everything else.
So kind of moving on, it's interesting to think about what the alternatives are. And so now in just the last couple of years, we've been presented with alternatives that people are thinking is a good thing. One of those is the Impossible Burger.
Yeah, it's funny because basically all this environmental destruction basically by the chemical agriculture is causing all these problems, and it's just absolutely terrible. And it seems like they just greenwash and bring in a solution to that. It's kind of detached a little bit because it's basically like there's all these kind of fake meat things coming out. Like they're blaming essentially meat farming for causing all these environmental problems. And granted, factory farming of meat, it does have an environmental impact. But pasture raising meat obviously does not. Pasture raising meat actually will build soil. But then the solution they present is like, well, then we all have to switch to fake meat. And that's, just more of the same. It's like it requires all monocropping. It's like that Impossible Burger is genetically modified. They're using genetically modified yeast to produce a protein that usually is only found in the root of soy plants. So it's not even something that humans eat generally, and they're putting that into their burger to make it more like blood. And it's basically like just they're calling for more of the same. It's like, we're having this environmental catastrophe, so let's ramp up what we've been doing and all switch over to this complete monocropping nightmare. Make sure we get rid of all the people who are actually eating meat that might actually be contributing to solving the problem, and we'll switch everybody to this. And the worst thing is that people are buying it. People are actually kind of like, oh yeah, I'm gonna help the environment by eating, having vegan Mondays, meat-free Mondays or meatless Mondays, whatever they're called.
Yeah, it kind of baffles me how we ever got to this point, really, because just looking at looking at the ingredients list.
Yeah.
How many ingredients are there? There's quite a lot, right? And you're going to be shipping those from different places in the world. So in contrast to a cow, which you could grow in your, which could roam around in your garden, and which you literally just have to kind of bolt in the head and then cut up into some pieces. I know that isn't how most people have their meat now, but I mean, technically speaking, you could realistically do that. And then compare that with all of the air miles, the thousands of miles, and then the petroleum and everything, all of the resources that are used to produce. And this isn't even factoring in the lab costs, the electricity, the incubation, all of the technological costs involved in kind of producing this artificial synthetic manufactured burger. Merely from an energy standpoint, it's like you think about how much this process is contributing to the overall kind of environmental pollution, along with, as Doug said, it's GMO, it's, monocrop, it's all of those other kinds of things. It's like, how on earth could anyone with a working brain look at the ingredients, look at the process of how this thing is made, and then honestly go along with the idea that this is somehow better for the environment?
Yeah. Or better for you.
Well, so much of it is kind of shoved down our throat now. Like a couple months ago, we did that show about human extinction, as far as what, if you stop flying and you stop driving and you stop eating meat, that you'll save stop having children, and it will save the planet.
Yeah.
And so you see this message, especially in social media. They don't address the industrial ag model. They don't address the synthetic fertilizers or chemicals or any of those things. What they do is they shift the kind of the focus, and their key corporate message is there's no alternative. There's no alternative to this. So we're just going to start creating things in a lab that make you feel good, that you're being a vegetarian or a vegan and you're doing the right thing. But don't look behind the curtain, just as Elliot was saying, about what actually is in these things and the amount of energy that it takes to produce just one of these. And I find it ironic they call it the impossible burger, because it's really impossible that this is out there and that it's so popular. I mean, I got to look through my notes here, but I mean, they're selling. People are buying them. I think 22,000 restaurants in the United States have the Impossible Burger on the menu now.
Yeah.
And so if you're not informed about where your food's coming from, in other than just a very kind of surface level, you're going to be like, oh, I'm doing the right thing. Look at this Impossible Burger. They're so great. They're so environmentally friendly.
It's unbelievable. It's kind of like there's a certain kind of like technological determinism involved in the whole thing. It's kind of like we keep on looking to technological solutions. And it seems like, I mean, this is essentially space food, right? Like this is what everybody was told in the 50s that we were going to be eating in the future, right? Like it was like just this, all the nutrients would be taken out of what we need, and you could eat a pill and that would be all you'd need for the entire day or something. I mean, we're getting there, right? This is kind of like on that road. It's the idea that you can just take all these constituent parts from all these different places, these synthesized vitamins and things like that, and roll them into one artificial food, and that's good enough. That's not even good enough, it's better. That's actually better than the real thing. Instead of kind of saying, you know what, like nature actually had this right. Maybe we should go back to what, to nature for a solution, instead of this hubris, this human hubris, this idea that we know better. It's unbelievable. It's only leading to, our destruction, essentially.
Most definitely. I mean, back to the Impossible Burger, back in 2015, the FDA raised questions about the genetically modified engineered heme in the burger. And, this is the FDA, sometimes called the, Fuel Death Association, or there's a lot of other acronyms that, can come along with that organization. But they did raise these questions. And despite their concerns, they got the GRAS it's called GRAS, generally recognized as safe stamp of approval. And it went ahead and they put the burger on the market starting in 2016. And so, all that the Impossible Food Company submitted as far as rat testing was minimal, a couple weeks study. And the agency said it didn't have any more questions about its safety.
Well, the crazy thing is that originally they said no. Originally, the Food and Drug Administration didn't allow it. And there was a study done where they fed rats the soy leg hemoglobin, I guess is how it's pronounced, or leg hemoglobin, which is basically that thing I was talking about before, which is like a protein that's found in the root of soy plants that has, it's similar to hemoglobin, so it's similar to like heme iron, which kind of is part of what gives meat its kind of characteristic taste and juiciness and whatnot. But they fed rats this stuff, and they actually found that the rats had unexplained weight gain, changes in the blood that can indicate the onset of inflammation or kidney disease, as well as possible signs of anemia. Now, the FDA rejected it, and then they basically just redid the study where they didn't find those things, and then they said, okay, that's fine, good. They didn't change anything. They changed the study, obviously. I wonder if it would just had to do with, like, they didn't grease the right palms on their first try, and then the second try they did. They figured it out. They're like, oh, I see. You wanted money. That's what it was. Here you go. And they're like, okay, everything looks to be in order here. We have no more questions.
Well, and it seems like this approach is, again, as I was saying earlier in the show, promotion of fake foods to give GMOs a new face, especially as we see, all these Monsanto settlements coming out about glyphosate and, all of a sudden it has to be rebranded as something that can save the planet now. Forget about the side effects of the ingredients. You got to save the planet first. You can't be selfish and worry about your own health. And, the industry, this whole plant-based food company industry, there was no money being put into it in 2009. It was not a thing. But by 2018, last year, it was over $600 million of investment. So these companies are, again, back to this idea of a business model. Like, instead of addressing the issues that we have with this obviously broken monocropping system, let's just put more money into something that's seriously questionable.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, these companies, I'm not really surprised. You can go from, kind of the more conspiratorial angle on the whole thing, but honestly, it just seems like these companies are kind of just seeing the writing on the wall, and they know that, or they're even dictating to a certain extent that there's going to be more of a demand for these meat substitute foods, because we're being basically brainwashed every second of the day that meat is destroying the environment, and if you eat meat, you're selfish. Therefore, this alternative is offered. But yeah, I don't blame these kind of like Silicon Valley types and stuff like that who are going into these businesses. For the one thing, it's like the profit that they're going to make, they're projecting anyway, is going to be huge. Because the brainwashing is working. People are switching over to these fake meats and things like that. It's like you were saying, Erica. This thing is popular. The Impossible Burger is popular.
It's impossible.
It's not possible. It's impossible.
If you were an investor, then it would be a great time to get into business, because the popularity has really spiked just in the past sort of 3 or 4 years, it seems. Mm-hmm. And there are many, many, many different vegans who are quite willing, actually, to sacrifice their own health in favor of this idea that they are somehow contributing to the betterment of humanity with regard to sustainability and protection of the environment, and kind of doing a service for the rest of humanity. And for these kinds of people, no matter how many research studies or kind of facts about nutrition and health, it doesn't really matter, because actually they've gone past caring about health. It's actually more to do with, like, they're happy to sacrifice that. And I think there's more people like that. And then there's the whole other branch of vegans who are genuinely believe that veganism is the most healthy diet for human beings, and therefore they jump onto the bandwagon as well. But ultimately, it just seems like humans. There's a large chunk of humans in the West, at least, who are ripe for this kind of programming, and they are jumping on board by the day.
Yeah, there was one study that I was reading that suggested by 2025, 60% of meat consumed will come from lab-grown products or plant-based alternatives.
That's it. I'll be the rest of that 40%.
Yeah, interestingly, like there's actually, I've spoken to quite a few meat eaters as well who aren't even, you wouldn't class them. They're not vegan. They eat meat, but they would prefer to eat lab grown meat because there is this belief that it somehow causes less suffering and is better for the environment, and it's the best thing to do. And so it's like, I think there are like a good chunk of people who are gonna welcome this, who are really, willing to give up proper meat and start eating lab grown meat.
Yeah, the lab grown thing is creepy, I think. I mean, aside from just being creepy, like we were talking about the fake meat and the Impossible Burger, it's like how much energy is actually going into producing that? How much actually has to, doesn't that thing cost like $8,000 for a burger at this point? So obviously there's a lot going into it. Like, it's not just, I don't know, the idea that going through this entire lab process and such an energy intensive process and so much that has to go on there, as opposed to throwing a cow on some grass and waiting. Yeah. It's like how can anybody think that this is a good solution?
Yeah, and from a farming standpoint, these lab made meat substitutes aren't going to regenerate the environment. They're not going to clean up the soil or the water. It's not a real solution to continue to inhabit the planet the way that we do. It's, again, just as Elliot said, energy intensive. And it would be interesting to find a study that actually showed how much it costs just on the energy level to produce something like this. And I'm sure it's been done, because there's such a back and forth about it that it sometimes is overwhelming to just try and follow it all. And so, as you were both saying, sometimes I guess it's easier to just eat the Impossible Burger and go on with your day.
Nope, it's not easier. I can honestly say that I will never, I won't even smell it. Impossible.
Well, and it's also, it affects every single person on the planet because, for most people, they eat 2 to 3 times a day. And so this is something that affects everyone, not just, people in America or people in Europe, but it's global. So we had an article that I thought maybe you'd like to address, Doug, because it's like, what is the alternative to this, what we called in a previous show, the vegan push, right? This kind of agenda. And the article was, if you care about the planet, eat more beef. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's basically, the idea is essentially that all this monocrop farming, industrial agriculture, chemical farming is just poison for the land. It's essentially just destroying the land. But meat farming, which gets, whatever they talk about meat farming and they say, oh, meat farming is terrible for the environment, we should all farm vegetables instead, and everybody has to eat less meat to save the environment. They're only talking about factory farming, essentially. They're not talking about, pasture-raised beef or lamb or whatever the case may be, pigs. Because when you're pasture raising animals, you're actually, that does regenerate the soil. That actually will build up the land rather than strip away from it. You picture like monocropping, basically you grow your plants and then you scoop them up and take them away. So when you grow these plants, they require all the minerals and nutrients from the soil, and then you're shipping them away. And you keep doing that and you ship it away, and you keep doing it and ship it away. It's like that's stripping all of that stuff out of the soil. And then you have to artificially put it back in with fertilizers and everything like that. Whereas if you have a properly managed, pastured meat agriculture, it's a cycle. Everything gets, the cow eats up the grass, has gets all the minerals and everything that it needs, and then it's pooping it out, and that's going back into the ground to be recycled, reused again. So it's just, when they talk about meat farming and they say, oh, meat farming is terrible for the planet, it's not. If it's done properly, it isn't bad at all. It's actually really good. When they start talking about how we have to eliminate all these cattle because they're farting and it's destroying the atmosphere, that doesn't make any sense. There used to be how many millions of buffalo in North America? I mean, those guys don't exist anymore. So how can we have the equivalent or less amount of cows, and suddenly they're bad for the environment? There wasn't any global warming back in 1200s or earlier. It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, and it's interesting how you're talking about the methane, the cow farts, because we've kind of joked about this on previous shows. But the lunatic farmer, his name is Joe Salatin, and he has polyface farms where they do exactly what Doug is talking about. And we'll get into this idea a little bit more in a minute. But he was talking about methane, and he says whether methane is emitted by fermentation is the same whether it occurs inside the cow or not. And whether the feed is eaten by an omnivore or an herbivore or left to rot on its own, the methane generated is identical. He said wetlands emit some 95% of all methane in the world. Herbivores are insignificant enough to not even merit consideration. So anyone who really wants to stop methane needs to start draining wetlands quick or we'll all perish. You know what I mean? So he makes a really good point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the whole carbon thing is a complete red herring anyway. I mean, the amount that carbon actually contributes to the climate is so insignificant. The climate is controlled by our sun. I'm sorry to say. That's what's going on there. And this whole palaver that's put up about carbon, I mean, it's so insidious, and like everybody is convinced now they're just drawn into this ridiculously simplistic explanation for things, and so that lets everything else kind of get away. They get away with so much else, like pollution is bad. It's really bad for sure, but it's not because of carbon. Or very little is because of carbon. There's so much other crap being put out into the environment that's actually way, way, way worse. But no one pays attention to that anymore. All it is carbon. Anybody talks about is carbon. That's it, just carbon. And it's so disheartening because it's just, they've really effectively just turned everybody's head, just go, mwah, and nobody can see anything anymore. It's just all it is carbon.
Yeah, they with the methane thing, it's like they've got the narrative and then they'll pick any piece of information that they can just to fit it in with that. It's like they don't care about the facts. They have their theory and then they wait for the facts afterwards, or they cherry pick ideas ideas, and they bank on the fact that the large majority of the public, are greatly uneducated in, on the topic of how much methane might actually be contributing to the environment. We just trust what the authorities say. But then when kind of specialists or really educated people come along and say, well, actually, this might not be technically true, they are labeled as heretics.
Yeah.
Climate change deniers. Yeah, climate deniers. And these people are the equivalent of Nazis.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So it's understandable, but it's still a problem.
Well, you've seen that whole thing happen in the whole GMO industry too, and I feel like I've been talking about this for 20 years, and I'm preaching to the choir. But if you had questions back in early 2000 about the safety of genetically modified organisms in your food, you were anti-science.
Yeah.
And when I started looking into it, I wasn't even concerned about the labeling of food or anything. I was concerned about the contamination of the soil, because once you get genetically modified microorganisms in your soil, you're never going to get rid of them. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I felt like, henny penny, the sky is falling. I'm crazy. Maybe I'm wrong. And then 20 years later, all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, it's basically like an antibiotic for the soil, and it's killing all biodiversity in the soil. Now we have this epidemic of, stomach issues and, gastrointestinal cancers. And so it's kind of turned out to be true in a way, is that anti-science? I don't know. That's questioning. It's like all the other things that are on the market, whether it's lead or, asbestos or
mercury,
you name it, Teflon, Yeah. I mean, it took 30 years, 40 years for DuPont to finally be sued for using Teflon and poisoning people. I don't know. Sometimes you do feel like, well, maybe I have lost the plot. I just need to move to a farm somewhere.
The whole anti-science argument is so ridiculous. Half the time the people who are critical of these things are scientists, or they're using science to build their argument. They're kind of looking at the science and saying, no, this isn't sound. This doesn't make any sense. And they get labeled anti-science. It's just ridiculous. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, is anybody really anti-science at this point? Honestly, I mean, I'm sure there's like some, Mennonite, Luddite people out there still, but like the vast majority of people are not going to be anti-science. I mean, it's just such a ridiculous thing.
Well, I think with the Mennonites and the Amish and these farming communities of people, they're like, forget your fancy techno crap. We're going to stick with what we know works.
In that sense, they're definitely right.
Their people.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good point. Maybe we should all become anti-science.
Yeah. I mean, I'm open to it, but and we don't have to go into all the corruption of science that happens in just this one small, side kind of industrial ag model. But you're beholden to big money, and your university is funded by biotech. I won't even say all the different numbers, but biotech funds your university, and they teach the ag program that's teaching all these young people how to farm, and they're not learning about regenerative agriculture or low intensive spraying or any of that. Then they don't have a model to work on.
Right. And the thing is
they need a job.
Well, yeah. And the thing is that that regenerative agriculture is science. Like those are people who are really studying this stuff and learning from it and observing and making adjustments. And like, it's not a method that's completely, done now. It's like, okay, we know how to do this. It's like, it's continually being innovated upon, and the science is being looked at. So yeah, the idea that it's somehow anti-science to actually work with nature is just, it's absurd.
Yeah, and I think, as with every show that we have, we try and offer some sort of possibility for solutions, or how can we remedy this whole situation? And I think this looking into regenerative and what they're calling agroecology, so coming back to these systems that people have been using for thousands of years to produce safe and local food is a very real possibility. But boy, do you see on the internet some strong hate campaigns against it. I mean,
Yeah. Some of it coming from the Impossible Burger, actually. They just said, what was it they said? They said some kind of catchy line like, it's the clean coal of the farming world, or something like that.
Yeah.
So basically saying that that it's just putting kind of a greenwashing. Essentially, they're saying that regenerative agriculture, basically, it's a myth and it's no better than regular agriculture. They're actually a really evil company, actually, when you really look at it. Like, the moms, what were they called? Moms Across America or something like that, who did a test of their burger and found out it had like 13 parts per billion of glyphosate in it or something like that. And then they turned around and said, well, they smeared them, essentially, and more or less doubled down and said, well, glyphosate's not a bad thing. It's like, oh, okay.
Wow. I mean, the hubris of that.
Yeah. But
yeah, the name of that article, if anyone's interested in reading it, it came out in June from this website called Grist. And they do a lot about animal farming and covered GMOs for several years. But it's called Impossible Foods and Regenerative Gravers Face Off in Carbon Farming Dust Up. And we won't go over the carbon thing again, but these guys just go on the attack.
Yeah. And it's not surprising, really. They're following kind of the Monsanto model of things, where it's kind of like anything that threatens to get in the way of you and your profits, you do anything, no matter how dirty, to eliminate them. So I mean, looking into the GMOs and stuff, like if you see the attacks that happen to people like Jeffrey Smith, or some of the other people, even to farmers themselves, they're just absolutely ruthless. So it's kind of like Impossible Foods is kind of following the same model in that sense. Anybody who speaks out against their thing is, well, they're anti-science, or they're not real scientists, or any number of other things. They just they just go on the attack.
Yeah, and I think initially it worked, with Jeffrey Smith, and Arnold Putztai is another guy that comes to mind, that where they figure if they just discredit these scientists to the point where they ruin their career, they'll stop doing research on it. And I think, just like you said, they're trying this again now, but they're going after this whole idea of regenerative farming, and that, it won't be able to realistically feed, the population. And, it's just not a model that you can scale up. But I mean, I think that's what needs to change as far as people's thought process about it, is instead of having anything that you want at the grocery store, and I'm talking about America here, and I'm sure it's the same in Europe, you can go to, I'll just use Walmart as an example, and you can buy anything pretty much, fruits and vegetables that are not it's not the season for them to be produced, but you can buy anything. And so if you're expecting to have that kind of availability of food, then you're not going to support something like regenerative agriculture, because you may only be able to eat certain things at certain times of the year.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? So I feel like it kind of speaks to this whole entitlement culture that we live in the United States. Like, my dollars, if I want to buy a peach in the middle of winter, I should be able to do that. But people have to change their idea of what food accessibility really means.
Yeah.
And, we see these in older times, and back to like the Amish and, these more kind of farm bound communities where, you ate meat that you had canned or preserved during the winter months, and maybe some root vegetables. And then during the summer, you had more access to things like berries and fresh vegetables. I mean, people are just spoiled. They want what they want.
Pretty much.
And the planet be damned as a result, you know?
Well, now they want it all reformed into a plant-based burger. That's what they're looking for. They don't even want vegetables anymore. They want an impossible burger.
It really makes me think of the movie Soylent Green. If anyone hasn't watched it recently,
definitely.
It's kind of an interesting take on all of this, because I just watched it recently, and they kept referring to the year 2018 in that movie, and that kind of freaked me out, because I was like, are we there? I mean, is the Impossible Burger the new Soylent Green? It's just got a nicer name, you know.
Well, there's even that protein or nutritional drink thing that's called Soylent.
Oh,
which is a creepy marketing on their part, I'd say.
And so maybe just kind of tie everything in and give a little bit of background for people who may not know what regenerative agriculture is, or even agroecology. So, well, I'll start with agroecology because the name kind of explains it. It's basically like a grassroots rural change that's independent and not controlled by biotech or agribusiness companies. So any kind of small farm, I think, is practicing agroecology, you know, reducing. I'm not the unrealistic type that you can't use some sort of pesticides now and again. You don't have to be 100% certified organic, but I can say a small farm is going to produce a lot more high quality food than, you know, a corporate Monsanto, Bayer, Cargill, Syngenta backed monocrop for sure. And it's providing solutions for people who don't have a lot of financial input. They can start small. I mean, you know, people are growing 700 pounds of food on a quarter acre of land, you know, I mean, that there's real production that can happen that can feed local communities. And I think that's really the model that people are trying and emanate. It also doesn't put the farmer in debt. So, you know, if in the US, like especially with soybean and GMO corn farmers, like they're, you know, mortgaged to the hilt, they have huge loans. And if the climate is erratic, which it is, they could lose everything and go bankrupt and lose their farm. Whereas these small little agroecology based farms, if there's major loss, it's not going to destroy their entire business. They can kind of, you know, regroup. And so basically it's just an alternative. With regenerative agriculture, it's more of farming principles and practices that increase soil biodiversity, improves watersheds, wetlands, and enhances ecosystems. So instead of cutting down trees to plant massive amounts of crops, you know, you work with the environment that you have. And it also, with regenerative agriculture, it can increase yields. It's resilient to climate instability, and there's better health and vitality in the food. So if people are composting and feeding their soil not chemical-based fertilizers, but things like animal poop and, you know, bat guano and kelp, then you have higher quality nutrients in the food, going back to what we talked about earlier. And it's not new. I mean, that's why I think the Green Revolution was so destructive to a place like India, because you had all of this wealth of knowledge that had sustained people for thousands of years. And you bring in this industrial model and you eliminate that knowledge. You basically steal that knowledge. And that's why Dr. Vandana Shiva calls it biopiracy. Like they're just co-opting all of these things away from people and giving them bullshit in return.
Yeah.
And food, you know?
Yeah.
I know we have a video too. Maybe we could play our little video about this regenerative agriculture. And I mean, it seems pretty self-explanatory even in the name.
Yeah. But it's a good clip.
Plenty of feed, all in the middle of a drought. David Marsh's farm on the southwest slopes of New South Wales is looking green now, but it hasn't always been this way.
In 1982, we didn't know how much grass we had. We reduced our numbers far too late, like so many, and we turned this place into a desert.
So what's helped transform the landscape from this to this? David Marsh says it's regenerative farming, a term still foreign to many primary producers, but one that's gaining fresh interest.
My definition, and I think a general definition of regenerative agriculture, is any practice or even philosophy which actually builds soil carbon.
Charlie Arnott is another passionate advocate of this relatively new approach to farming. He stopped using chemicals and started making his own liquid compost.
We used to go and buy bags of fertiliser, we used to buy pesticide, herbicide. We spent a lot of our time killing things to grow things, which is crazy.
It's also about giving the grass a chance to recover. Cell grazing is a technique where cattle are kept in smaller paddocks.
So they're moving on to new feed every 24 hours. So we can see a long way ahead. There's 150 days of grass ahead of our stock now in a time that's actually been a very dry 18 months.
And it's allowed native vegetation, including grasses, to come back.
The roots actually hanging onto the soil.
In a drought, it's unusual to see soil looking this healthy.
But the smell is really important. It should smell like your grandmother's old garden, veggie garden.
Farmers are not rushing to take up regenerative methods, mainly because of the setup costs. But a long-term study of 16 farmers found that they are generally making more money, especially when it's dry. Younger farmers are sitting up and taking notice.
I think there's probably more to learn from our landscapes, just letting them or giving them the chance to express themselves a bit more.
If we could manage so that we kept water on our farms, our soil structure was improving, the life in our soils was improving, our animals were healthy, that would be a huge thing for this country.
Greener pastures, defying the drought. David Claughton, ABC News, Burrawa.
Very encouraging.
Very encouraging.
Yeah.
And as I said earlier, Joel Salatin, he's from Polyface Farms, which is in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. He's written many books and has lectures across the United States and writes, articles. They call him the lunatic farmer. A great article, The Rise of Rogue Food, and you can watch an hour-long interview with him. Same kind of idea, that using the animals to support rebuilding the soils and what does he call it? Neanderthal farming. Like you don't need, all this technology, and he really doesn't want deep pocket corporations controlling production and distribution.
Yeah.
So this is kind of his revolt against industrial ag.
Yeah.
I've seen him speak. He's very great. He's a great speaker.
Yeah, he was really, he's one of the pioneers of kind of this resurgence of these kinds of methods, and has some pretty ingenious ideas too. And he's been really big on promoting this style and kind of exporting this to other farms, kind of teaching other farmers how to do this. So he's been pretty instrumental in the whole movement.
Yeah, and he's gotten attacked too. So
Yeah.
He has a great book if anyone's interested. It's called, I have it right here, Everything I Want to Do is Illegal.
Good title.
And just about how, they can't slaughter their own animals on their farm because of, FDA or USDA regulations and whatnot. And he writes in a very entertaining style, because this is insane. We've completely lost our mind.
Pretty much.
Well, I think that's pretty much it. I mean, I know there's a lot more out there. If anyone's interested, we have done shows in the past. There are articles on SOT.net about the evils of industrial agriculture. But thank you for joining us. Please like and subscribe to our Objective Health YouTube page. And we will be back next week with another interesting topic.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.